management process that we'll be talking about today is a fairly simple one. If you were to Google project management process, you would find there are many, many of them. So the one we're using here is define, plan, manage, and review. So starting with the define. Important part about the define phase is that, that you really want to plan to spend most of your time, likely, certainly up front, with this phase. And you will be well served. It's well worth it to spend that time at the beginning to define the project and all the aspects with it. And it really could make the difference between success or failure, being on budget or under versus over budget, and also lack of clarification and getting rid of some confusion in the project. So what's really important here is who has the buy-in on your project. And initially, the first person you want to define is your sponsor. The sponsor may actually be the person who gave you this project. They may be the one that set it on your desk or sent it into your inbox and said, hey, I need you to do this. They are the ones who are in charge of driving it toward the directions that will bring the project to successful realization. They may have some connections in senior leadership level. They also generally have the authority to dedicate resources and support to the project. So you want to think about what their role is going to be in the project as well. And will they be an active team member within the plan, managing, and review phases, or will they really be just the one who sort of sets you on the path and gives you the thumbs up or wants to check in? So knowing those things is important. So application number 2, of course, is jotting down who is your project sponsor. Now, you may have more than one project sponsor, as we did, and we will talk about that in just a minute. So the first thing or the next thing I should say, after defining or developing who your sponsor is starting to think about what questions do you have for them. What we've put on this slide here is just 10 options for questions, plus some additionals there within the multiple questions, and thinking about from here, how many of these can you define already? Can you answer already? Or how many of these do you have additional questions about? If the more you can think ahead of on this and have some, understanding what you think, for example, the project purpose is or the problem that it's attempting to solve, the more you can think in advance of that, the better conversation you will have when you meet with your sponsor and have a chance to review all of these questions and get their input, their perspective on it. There may be things that they actually don't know as well, and they may need to go and ask others. So for example, they may have the ability to offer support and resources, but maybe they are unclear on how many or how much or how many dollars or who they can assign. So some of those things will help answer questions, but some of that will also bring up some other things for you to look at. So the third application here, like I mentioned, is for you to start thinking of answering these questions before meeting with your sponsor and then setting up a time to meet with your sponsor. All right, now we'll move over to Brock's input here on our successes and challenges with our case study project.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So for our redesign, we had a very clear success in terms of defining our sponsors, in that our sponsors were very, very clear at the beginning in 2023 and early 2024. Of course, they were clear, right? Because those were the folks who wanted to really get this project rolling. That said, further down the road, we experienced some challenges where the project priority didn't really maintain that sponsor continuity through our organizational changes, we had our vice chancellor and our chancellor depart for the Prescott campus depart the university. And so it was difficult in that our top level sponsor wasn't replaced for quite some time. And then our next level sponsor within the assistant dean of student support services was reassigned their position. And so we've certainly had some change in our organizational structure. And so that can have some implications for the direction of the entire redesign, which we'll discuss a little bit later.
Okay, next step here is to define who are the stakeholders in your project. And these are folks who have some sort of an interest or a role in your project. Now, you really want to think broadly about this. These are people whose expertise you need. They may be folks who have just interest. They may be your supervisor, but maybe your supervisor isn't even the sponsor necessarily. It could be continuing on internal stakeholders, maybe multiple campuses, and that's what we found. We had Daytona Beach interest in being stakeholders, and then also potentially there's some external parties who are interested in being stakeholders. Maybe you work for an institution. I realize we're all Embry-Riddle here, but I have presented this with community colleges who have external stakeholders in the community, and that's a possibility. I think that's a possibility with any project, any organization. So you want to think about what's their level of involvement going to be. Would they be part of the project team as far as bringing in expertise, perspective? Maybe they're just the folks who you want to keep informed about how it's going with regular check-ins, but not the ones who are going to be coming to meetings and actually doing some of the work during the planning and managing side of things. And then you want to meet with them individually, ideally, if you can, to share your project vision, to explain how you see their role in it, and then, of course, to ask for their participation, their expertise, or their support along the way. This, along with the stakeholder, is again super significant in whether your project's going to have momentum and moving forward, and could really make the difference between success and failure in your project. So your next application is to start to list your project stakeholders. Start to list all of those that you can think of that you think might be interested, even if you haven't talked to them yet. Also list, if you don't know who they are specifically, list the role of that stakeholder. So for example, if you need somebody from facilities because there's something physical involved, or a move, or something that needs to be done in that way, then make sure you list facilities, the director at least. If you have something that you need some IT expertise in, but you have no idea who that's going to be, list that role as well. All right, Brock, tell about the
Yeah.
successes and challenges here.
Certainly. So for our case study, we really had a large success with identifying just over 50 stakeholders for our redesign project. I should mention that this success was not something that was just, delivered to our doorstep. This was something that Lisa had to work the entire first semester, building those relationships and kind of having a listening tour. She visited every single unit section that we had and really developed a relationship with a lot of our university staff and faculty. And so that helped us really form a tribe to get behind this redesign for first year experience. Now, with some challenges, a lot of those stakeholders had some interest and they really wanted to contribute, but because of varied availability and sometimes just because this was an add-on into their role and they may not have the bandwidth to participate, we did see some gaps in representation, particularly amongst different colleges. Within our College of Arts and Sciences and Business Security and Intelligence, we had quite a bit of engagement from not only staff, but also faculty and deans and department chairs, whereas not so much with some other colleges and departments. And that said, some of our stakeholders also left the university, and it's difficult to catch somebody up to speed about halfway through.
All right. So the last thing that kind of moves from the define phase to the plan phase is your kickoff event. And if you could see me, I would kind of be doing air quotes around event, but because it doesn't necessarily have to be a party, although it could. It just depends on your project and your people and your funding, I think. But basically, the purpose of the kickoff is to share the project's vision, to start to build that team cohesiveness with the folks who really are going to be working with you throughout, to introduce the stakeholders to each other. That was, as a side note, one of those things that I didn't expect, was that a lot of the folks who were coming, of those 50 people who were coming together to help with this, they didn't know each other necessarily, even though we work at a relatively small campus here. And then to explain where their roles fit in the project, because some of them were at the very beginning of the project, and some of them weren't even going to come in until nearer to the end of the project. And then, of course, part of that is the timeline. So the timeline will give them a sense of what are they committing to. So as an application here, I would suggest you think about how you might build that cohesiveness in a kickoff meeting or event. And you might consider who it is that's coming to that. If you're working with a staff of, or a group, a project team, maybe of all students, maybe doing some fun icebreakers might be that cohesiveness. But if you're working with folks that are more on the professional end, maybe leadership end, that might or might not fit for that group, and the amount of time and focus you can give to this kickoff. But it's still important to bring them all together so everybody gets the same message. All right, Brock's turn.
Yay. So for our case study, for our kickoff event, we were able to provide lunch for all of the attendees. And as Lisa kind of mentioned, those introductions were very powerful in that it allowed those who were attending the opportunity to learn about some roles on campus that they were otherwise unaware of. But it also allowed for a lot of people to express their interest in participating. We had a lot of folks who said, hey, I think this would be a great fit for the redesign. And you're really able to harness that energy and engagement and say, hey, we really appreciate your input. We would love for you to participate in one of our task groups, which we'll discuss a little bit later. And then Lisa delivered a PowerPoint presentation, and we left plenty of time for questions at the end. And some of those remained within the room. And then, of course, as time went on, the conversations meandered into the hallway, because there were some folks who had quite a bit more that they were curious about than others. Now, some challenges with this kickoff meeting, of course, you'll notice a recurring theme is scheduling. Not everybody was available to attend. That said, we were able to kind of mitigate that challenge to an extent by offering a recording and distributing that to everybody after the meeting. And of course, the cost to feed 50 people is it's relatively significant. And so looking for some sponsors, even just for this event, may serve you well.
All right, next we move into the planning phase. So this is where we're creating the plan for the project. And my suggestions include using some sort of planning document or program that will list your start dates, your due dates, the categories of work that you're going to be doing, who's assigned. We have access to, of course, the Microsoft SharePoint here through Embry-Riddle, and also Microsoft Project and Microsoft Planner. I know others, I haven't used these other two, but I know of Asana and Trello. There are lots of other planning programs that you might choose though. And you want to pick something that's big enough, but not too huge and complex for what you're doing. Also, you want to make sure you identify the milestones along the way, and so that you know the broad sections of what's going on. And you'll see how we did that here with the task groups that Brock mentioned earlier. Part of your plan is also including a communication plan. That might be one of the special jobs of one of your team members, is putting together that communication plan. and working with you, because your role as the project manager is to do the communication with everyone throughout the process. So you want to consider how you're going to communicate to your different sets of stakeholders. Your sponsor might be someone who wants to really keep their fingers dirty in the project. Maybe not. Maybe you don't want them to. But that level of communication might be different from your communication to your project team as they're working through the actual plan. And it might be different then from what you're sharing externally to the broader campus, with maybe through the marketing department or something like that, and then externally. So these different levels of communication are really important, because not everybody needs the same information. And frankly, sometimes you don't want everybody to have the same information. You want to give them the broader picture if they're the ones who just need the broader picture. Of course, once you have all of these things developed, you want to share that plan with your stakeholders and your sponsor as appropriate. Depending on the level of details in there, you may or may not need everyone to have that same level of access. One more thing you want to consider when you're creating your plan is how will you deal with changes once you're executing and you're in that management side of the plan. Because although you can't anticipate all the changes, you certainly can think about in advance what might be most likely to change, and how will you address that? How quickly will you take action on those? So the next application is, if you're working through this while you're listening to us, is to start to write down at least 2 tasks that are relevant to your project. This is just getting this started. 2 tasks probably is so short that it wouldn't make a project. It'd make a grocery list. But you're going to start this 2 tasks so that you can move out toward your broader tasks that you're going to be putting into your plan and where those milestones will be. All right, Brock.
Excellent. Thanks, Lisa. So to pull the curtain back a little bit and show you some of the successes and challenges with our planning phase, we selected Microsoft Planner and Microsoft SharePoint at the beginning there, primarily because they're free to use and through Embry-Riddle and already relatively prevalent throughout the university. And we shared those plans and those tools with our sponsor and administration, and that allowed a little bit of passive communication where they could kind of go in and see how things are progressing without any sort of direct communication. Of course, we also directly communicated with them. Now, within this planner, we also had a sequence of tasks, milestones, and due dates that were developed. And in a moment, we'll show you kind of a visual that we distributed for that. I should mention that all of those kind of, as Lisa mentioned, you have to plan for changes. And so we had developed those with optimism, and also understanding that it would kind of flex almost in a jello fashion, and that things may end up being completed sooner or slightly later than it originally anticipated. And then from all of that, we were able to assign the stakeholders and people who are interested in participating in this project into a certain task group based on their background. Now, some challenges that we had with this planning phase is that we inconsistently used Microsoft Planner primarily because of its lackluster integration with SharePoint, and that some things would appear in Planner and not in SharePoint and vice versa. And there was also a relatively large challenge in identifying times that worked for all members of a task group. We used When is Good as a scheduling tool to help try to mitigate that challenge a little bit. And I should mention a lot of our task groups, we would have different people attending each task group meeting. And so planning a little bit of extra time within those meetings to catch people who maybe didn't make it to the last meeting up to speed was very helpful for us. And so on the next slide here, you'll see we have our redesign sequence. On the left-hand side, you can see those are the different task groups, and we would communicate these groups with those who are assigned to them. And so somebody would receive this sort of sequence in an email and see, oh, I'm in the class model group. And they can go on the left there, they can see where they are, they're that green one there. And then coming on over into the middle, they can see the approximate dates in which they would like to, or that they would be participating happening within this group. Something else that I'll call your attention to with this sequence is you'll notice that some of our groups were concurrent in that we had our class model and faculty and CAM roles, hiring, pay, and training all at the same time, right? Because they didn't necessarily need to build off of one another. But you'll notice that we have our course description and outcomes group. They started prior to success measurements and redesigning that class model because it was very sequential, right? Where the group that comes after course description and outcomes use the deliverables from that group to then build on it and continue with their work. And so, yeah, that's a little bit of our sequence there. And Lisa's going to talk to you about our manage phase.
And actually, before we get there, just because I wanted to tie this back to the teaching and learning side, and I don't think I was very clear at the beginning. Part of, and you can see in our title on this slide, what we were redesigning initially was the Univ 101 class, which is the College Success One Credit class. And so that's where our task groups, how those line up with our redesign project, was really focusing on the class, the course description, how are we going to know if it's successful? How do we want to teach this class? Who do we want to teach it? What lesson plans? And then how are we going to combine with our external partners for complementary workshops, and then figuring out the locations. So I just wanted to point that out because I think it's more relevant for this specific conference here. All right, moving into the manage phase, and I know we have just a few more minutes here, and then we'll open it up for some questions. But this is where you're executing the plan. So the important part on this, as you can see by the 3 communicates, is to keep communicating with the people who are doing the task. So in our case, our task groups, with your stakeholder, your external stakeholders who are maybe not working in that task group, so that they know kind of what's happening along the way and when their group's going to come up. And then also with your sponsor, as your communication plan had put together shows. Also, you want to be able to keep your project plan updated. So that pretty slide that we had just before, that had a couple different iterations of when the actual dates were actually working out overall. So just keep those kind of things up to date. Of course, you want to ask questions of your team who's doing the work, of the sponsor, and really stay in touch with the work, because although you may not be literally sitting there and doing the work of those project groups, it's important that you know what's going on, because you're going to be the one who's asked when you're the project manager, and you're be the one who needs to describe it or ask for more resources or go find out who else you need as support. And then, of course, any addressing and managing any changes is super important, because that team that's working on something may get stuck and not be able to move forward until that change is corrected. So that the application under this is, sorry, I went forward one too many there. What aspects of your project are more likely to change, and how might you manage those changes? If there's any areas that are undefined at the time that you're really kicking this off, those are likely going to be the ones that are going to change, because you need to at least put some definition to them. So think about that in advance. I mentioned it earlier, and that's super important. So,
Yeah,
Brock's turn.
thank you. Just briefly, I'm gonna touch on this. I know we're pretty much out of time here. For our successes, really, we had a strong buy-in from our shareholders, and they were able to work really well within our task groups and produce deliverables. And at the end of the day, 4 of our task groups were able to complete their work and produce deliverables. And again, those deliverables oftentimes built upon each other within our sequence with our task groups. Some challenges, of course, there were communication difficulties due to that leadership and sponsor change that I mentioned earlier, and some staff reorganization. And so at this point, we've kind of taken a pause with our remaining 3 task groups, awaiting some additional direction for the first year experience department, with a new anticipated launch date of fall of 2026.
Okay, the last phase is the review phase. And this is when you finally get to finish your project, and you come to all of those outcomes that you were working toward, whether it's a product, a service, a class in our case. And you really want to make sure that it doesn't just sort of slink off into the night. You want to communicate to all those stakeholders and sort of toot your own horn, right? Now, part of that would be gathering the team that did the work and talking about kind of doing a debrief on, did we achieve our goals? How are we measuring our achievement of those goals? What did we learn? Why is it important to take what we learned and be prepared to apply that to the next project we're doing? And then what's unfinished or what will need maintenance? So as an example of our project, once we get the course kicked off, and everything working in that way, well, I can't just walk away. I actually was hired to manage that as well. So is it going to be my job? Do I need additional staff? Who's going to be doing that? And then, of course, just part of that celebration and the review is celebrating the work that we did, especially if it lasted a long time. So as far as our case study, we don't have another slide on that because we haven't gotten to that point yet. As Brock mentioned earlier, we've had to put some things on pause. But let's bring this back around to the takeaways. Just our final slide is hopefully there's something valuable here, even though this was a very quick session, about how the project management model might be valuable for organizing your projects in higher education. Also, thinking about why are the stakeholders important to higher education projects. We are a people organization. We are in the people business, students and faculty and staff, but students being our primary people that we're serving here. So why is it important to make sure we have all of this buy-in? And then lastly, what's your first project step when you get back to your office or when you log off the Zoom meeting? You know, what can you take away from this and apply? All right, so that's it for us. And I don't know if anybody has any questions.
Yes, please feel free to come off of chat or come off of mute if anyone wants to jump in with a question. I see there was one that you already addressed in the chat there. Does anyone else have any questions before we end this session?
Sure, I can ask a quick one, Cody, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Thanks for a great session, Lisa and Brock. Just something that can come up depending on the level of project that you are dealing with. Can you provide insight into keeping project stakeholders and participants accountable for providing updates and staying on schedule, especially those who are in roles that are senior to you, the PM, or beyond your reporting structure?
Yes, I would say that that's way back in that first define phase, when you are meeting with those either assigned, because sometimes people are voluntold, right, to be part of your project. But building those relationships up front is going to be key for this. So that then, and as the project managers and the admins helping out with moving the project forward along the way, sending reminders so that communication plan isn't just, we have a meeting next week, or here's what we've finished. It's also, hey, we have a meeting next week and your task group is responsible for presenting these 2 or 3 things that they've put together. So I'm not sure if that answers that whole thing. I know there's a little bit you asked about, Chris, about folks above you, because you have to kind of manage up on that. But I think building those relationships and coming to those meetings with clearly having thought through some of the challenges and some of the opportunities of your project is key for that.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Thank you,
You're
Lisa.
welcome.
Thank you, Brock, for a great session. It's great to see the strategy of define, plan, manage, and review, and just give that reminder for like the practical application. And, you know, I really appreciate the comment about the students being the key stakeholders and really making that connection. So thank you for sharing your insights. We really appreciate it. Just a few reminders for our participants here. The next session is going to start at 2 p.m. following this. And then following that session, we have a keynote speaker, Dr. Kelly Austin. So we hope you'll all be able to join us, and we look forward to seeing you in future sessions. Thank you again, Brock and Lisa.
Thank you.